Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chavches, Volume 28, the Sicha for Parshas Masei. This Sicha will explain the virtue of the chamber of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, and likewise the purpose, the task of the Kohen Gadol. And this relates to the fact that these days, that is in the 3 weeks, we study the laws of the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And this also connects to our parsha specifically, as there is an explanation from the Rebbe's father that is connected to the topic of the cities of refuge and the killer, the unintentional killer, the murderer, having to go there until the Kohen Gadol dies. So as a means of introduction, so we can be better familiar with some of the topics, the concepts that are mentioned in the Sicha, the difference between the Mishkan that was built in the desert and the Beis HaMikdash, the permanent Beis HaMikdash, is that the Mishkan was made out of wood, whereas the Beis HaMikdash was made out of permanent material, was made out of stone. In fact, the rule is that fundamentally, or in principle, you're not allowed to build any whatsoever wood in the Beis HaMikdash. Another thing to be familiar with, the essence of the service of the Kohen Gadol, of his purpose, of his task, expressed itself on Yom Kippur. Because on Yom Kippur, he was the one who led all the services, and he was the one who went into the Beis HaMikdash. In fact, already 7 days before, they would isolate him from everyone else, that he can become pure and elevated and ready for this task. Another thing to be familiar with is the teachings of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, the Rebbe's father, and the stories that are associated with it, how he wrote his notes on scraps of paper or on margins of the several books that he had. So we don't have that much of his Torah, but what we do have is very, very vast, because he wrote on the Tanya, he wrote on the Zohar, and even some Mishnah, whatever books he had available to him, he wrote on the margins of the pages. In the end of the 60s, they started printing the Rebbe's father's works, and from then on, the Rebbe would elaborate, would teach, would explain and explore his father's teachings in every Shabbos Farbrengen, or every Farbrengen that was associated with Shabbos. One more thing, in the Bayis Sheni, during the era of the second Beis HaMikdash, especially towards the end, the last period of it, unfortunately there was vast corruption. And this basically resulted in the fact that Kohanim Gedolim, the high priests, were not necessarily fit for the job. They were not necessarily selected in accordance with their virtue. Rather, they would buy their way in. Literally, it was very corrupted, and they would bribe the officials and buy their way in. As a result, because they weren't really fit, and Hashem knows that, they would not actually complete their year, quote unquote. Why? Because they would go in on Yom Kippur to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and they would perish because they were really not fit for the job. One more last thing, the difference between the avodah of tzaddikim versus the avodah of Balei Tshuva. Tzaddikim continuously go higher and higher. Balei Tshuva go higher and higher. But there's a fundamental difference. Tzaddikim, they are always going in a proportional manner. Or you can say, even when it seems to be disproportionate, it's always in the same sphere, in the same realm. Versus Balei Tshuva, that their avodah is basically that they have an absolute and total transformation, going from one extreme to another. Let's go into the Sicha. So it's well known what the Bashalah writes in reference to these three parshios, Matos, Masei, and Devarim, that always, without exception, they're always read in the 3 weeks. Why, he says? Because it's a timely matter. And he goes on to explain how they connect, how these three parshios in particular connect to this time period of the 3 weeks. Now, says the Rebbe, according to what has been said many times, that in the days of the 3 weeks, it's not only about mourning the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, but rather it's about strengthening our hope and anticipation of Mashiach coming any day, and that we need to have a special diligence in studying, learning about the building of the Beis HaMikdash, as if, so to speak, to build it through our learning. So it's understood that these parshios are not only connected to the mourning aspect of these days, but rather to the geula, to the redemption aspect of these days. So in order to explain this, says the Rebbe, there is an interesting explanation, an insight from Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, the Rebbe's father, on something that's mentioned in our parsha, and that is that the hoireg bishgaga, a person who killed unintentionally, the murderer has to go to Ori Miklot, he has to go to the cities of refuge, he's literally exiled there, and he has to remain there, it says, V'yoshav ba ad mois hakoyen hagadol. He has to remain there until the Kohen hagadol passes, the high priest passes. So according to this explanation that the Rebbe's father gives on this verse, we'll have an appreciation of a halacha which is connected to the building of the Beis HaMikdash. So let's first learn the halacha of the building of Beis HaMikdash, and then we'll come to the explanation of the Rebbe's father. So in the first chapter of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, which is the laws of Beis HaMikdash in the Rambam, he writes, quote, "And you do not build in it," meaning in the main chambers, and the Heichal and the Azara, "any whatsoever protruding wood at all." No protruding wood, rather only stones or bricks. Now the Ravid asks a question on this, and he says, how can you say such a thing? How can you state that emphatically that this is the halacha when it's a well-known fact that the Lishkas Kohen Gadol, the chamber of the Kohen Gadol, was made of wood? And he says it's not my, so to speak, it's not my own idea. Rather, says the Ravid, this is recorded very, very explicitly in Maseches Midos, in the tractate in Mishnayos, which discusses the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And there it says that it was made of wood. Now, perhaps we could answer that the Rambam forewarned this by writing the word boilate, extruding, or protruding. That means the Rambam himself doesn't disagree that there could have been a chamber that was made out of wood, but rather that it wasn't protruding, it wasn't visible. What met the eye was not wood. Rather, it was made of wood, perhaps, for whatever reason, as we'll get to later, but it was covered with plaster or what have you. Now, what is the source for this? The source for this, in other words, to suggest such an answer, we know that in Maseches Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara says that when Shlomo HaMelech built the inner courtyard, which is the Ezra's Kohanim, the Ezra's Yisrael, it says that he did 3 rows of chiseled stone, the verse says, and 1 row of cut wood, cedar wood, very strong, powerful wood. And the Gemara explains that what this means is that Shlomo HaMelech embedded the wood into the structure, and he plastered over it. That means there was no wood visible. So perhaps, based on that, you can say that indeed it was called the chamber of wood. However, it was in a manner that was permissible, at least explaining the Rambam. Now, this all helps us understand how they were able to do it. In other words, we can even explain, even according to the Rambam, who maintains that it's forbidden to build with wood, you can explain and justify how this chamber had wood, but yet, since it wasn't boilate, since it wasn't visible, since it wasn't extruding, it was covered up, so it's okay. But it doesn't help to explain why. Why would they have built it of wood if, generally speaking, there should be no wood built into the Beis HaMikdash? Why would they do it? Now, the Tosfos Yontif suggests that the reason for it is building this chamber of wood, meaning that it was different than the rest of the structure, the entire structure of the Beis HaMikdash, which was made strictly and exclusively out of stone. He says this is similar to the idea that it's brought down that why is it that the various chambers which the Kohen Gadol had to visit on Yom Kippur to do the various tasks, why were they so far from each other and back and forth and back and forth? In other words, why couldn't they have been set up in a manner where it was almost more convenient and pleasant to deal with? Why would they impose it on him? Why did Hashem make it so? And it's explained that the reason for it is because since the Kohen Gadol is the most important servant, the most important person, he's representing all of Am Yisrael on Yom Kippur, he might become actually carried away with his own ego. Shema tazuach daitoi. Maybe he'll get a little haughty in his mind. And therefore, by tiring him out, by weakening him out, by making him weak, he'd stay humble. Perhaps, says that the Tosfos Yontif, this is the reason why the chamber in which he resided for the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur, including Yom Kippur, was made out of wood. It was different than all the other chambers. Perhaps this served the same purpose to keep him in check as far as ego is concerned. Says the Rebbe, this is a nice answer, but it's not sufficient enough to explain that they should build the entire room for the entire time out of this, especially considering that they already have various methods built in, as we just explained, in order to keep him in check. Why would they have to go further and build this chamber different than all the other chambers, all the other halls in the Beis Hamikdash, just for this purpose? So the Rebbe's father, on his comments to Maseches Midos, again, Maseches Midos is the tractate in which we have the dimensions and the description of the building of the Beis Hamikdash. He says the following: the chamber of the Kohen Gadol is called, underscore the word, is called the chamber of wood, Lishkas Ha'etz, because as long as the Kohen Gedolim, as long as the high priests were fit for the job and they were righteous, they were tzaddikim, that they had arichas yomim. Remember, they did not expire every year, but they remained in their position for many, many, many years. And for example, Shimon HaTzadik, the famous Shimon HaTzadik, who served as a Kohen Gadol for tens of years, for many, many, many decades. However, after Shimon HaTzadik, says the Rebbe's father, that's when they changed the name. That's when they changed the name of this chamber from Lishkas Ha'etzim to Lishkas Parhedrin. What is Parhedrin? The Gemara explains that Parhedrin is like a certain type of an appointee that every 12 months they change. Because indeed, as we said, many of these Kohanim Gedolim, since they were unfit for the job, unfortunately they didn't last for more than 12 months. And they would have to be rotated, have to be changed every 12 months. And the Rebbe's father goes on to explain that the idea of wood inherently is a symbol of arichas yomim, of long life. In fact, he brings a verse from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, that it says, Kimei ha'etz yemei ami, that Hashem says, it's like the days, the years, the longevity of wood, so is the longevity of my people. So you see that wood inherently is a symbol, is a remez for long life. And this is synonymous with their righteousness, that because they were righteous, that's why they did not die every year. And then he explains that the idea of long life is connected to the right aspect of things, which is chesed. And he brings the proof for it, and says what happened from our parsha, that when a Kohen Gadol, when a person kills b'shoigeg, and he is forced to, and he's exiled to the Arei Miklo, to the cities of refuge, and it says there that he has to remain there ad mois haKohen Gadol, until the Kohen Gadol dies. What connection does the Kohen Gadol have to his terrible action, his terrible deed of taking another human's life, or taking a Yid's life? So he explains that what is a Reitzeach? What is a murderer? A murderer shortens the days. He shortens the life of a person. Kohen Gadol lengthens the life of a person, and therefore it's not fitting that the person who shortens the life of a person should be in the face of the person who lengthens the life of a person. And that's why he has to wait until that Kohen Gadol passes away. And this edition of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak perhaps helps explain why it was called the Lishkas Ha'etzim, why it was called the Chamber of the Wood. This is to explain that it was called the Chamber of the Wood not only when the Kohanim Gedolim were actually Meirich Yomim, not only when the Kohanim Gedolim, when the high priests were righteous and actually brought about the longevity, the lengthening of days, the long life for themselves and for others. Even perhaps when they weren't the most righteous, but this is to bring out that the essence, the whole idea of a Kohen Gadol is the idea of Arichas Yamim, of lengthening of days. And this applies in all times, in all places. And this helps explain why. Remember, we asked, why did they build this chamber out of wood? Because this chamber was exclusive for the residents of the Kohen Gadol during that time period of preparing him for the service of Yom Kippur. And, as the Rabbi Levitzky just explained, the whole idea of a Kohen Gadol, the essence of the Kohen Gadol, is the idea of long life, of bringing about arichas yamim, and therefore they built it out of wood, because wood is a symbol of arichas yamim. Now that we explained this, we have a question. If that's the case, if we say that the whole idea, the wood, is to symbolize the essence, the idea of a Kohen Gadol, which is long life, arichas yamim, then why did they cover it up? Why would they plaster it with plaster? Remember, we explained that according to the Rambam, and perhaps no one disagrees with that, it was built out of wood, but you didn't see the wood. You didn't see this beautiful wood, polished wood. Rather, it was covered up with plaster. And for all practical intents and purposes, a person who didn't know would imagine that maybe there's stone behind it. Why would they cover it up? Perhaps after the time of Shimon HaTzadik, when no longer did they really have this aspect of Arichas Yamim in real time, because unfortunately they were not Ma'arich Yamim. We can say perhaps then they covered it up. It makes sense, because even though the essence of the Kohen Gadol is the idea of Arichas Yamim, but they were not actual symbols of it, because in actuality they were passing away young because they weren't fit for the job. But the question is, throughout all times, in the times of Shimon HaTzadik, or before him, when there were great Kohanim Gedolim, great Tzaddikim who were Ma'arich Yamim, why would they cover up the wood if, like we just said, the wood is the essence, is the symbol of what the Kohen Gadol is all about? So to understand this, we have to take a closer look and appreciate what really is the meaning and the purpose of calling it Lishkas Parhedrin. Because on the face of it, it would seem that this is wrong. In other words, you can ask the question, what's the point? To call it a negative, an insulting term, insulting name? Is this to bring out how the Kohanim Gedolim are less than? Why would we do it? Why would we intentionally call this chamber a name which openly defames the Kohanim Gedolim of that time? Now, perhaps we can say, no, it's not really a negative name. It's not really a defamation, because really in the essence of it, as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, this was actually a virtue. Think about these people. They knew that they're not fit, they're not up to the job. They knew that they're not the best candidates for the job. And they knew the risks they're taking, that they may not survive this for more than a year. But their desire to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to connect to Hashem on that level, was so intense, was so great, that they were ready to give up their lives for it, to risk their lives for it at least, and not only that, to give all that money, which for many of them was perhaps everything they were worth. So perhaps one can suggest that this is the reason why it's not a negative name, it's not an insult to call it Parhedrin, but says the Rebbe, this is not enough. This is not sufficient. Because the bottom line is that even though you can find some virtue, some merit in what they did, but that is still not the right, proper way of doing it. In other words, it's a negative conduct, because it's not aligned with halacha. Moreover, when did they use this room? When was this room exclusive for the Kohen Gadol? During the 7 days in which they isolated the Kohen Gadol from everyone else, to elevate him, to bring him to a higher level, that he should be ready to represent the Yidden. Does it make sense that only for that, when this is the main purpose of the room, that they're going to call the room such an insulting, such a negative term? Says the Rebbe, this leaves us to the conclusion that actually Lishkas Parhedrin has a very, very positive connotation, and it brings out something superb about the Kohanim Gedolim. And says the Rebbe, this is the idea. What is the main point of the Avodah of Yom Kippur? What is really the main point, if you have to sum it up? Teshuvah. Now, what is the main aspect of Teshuvah versus the Avodah of Tzaddikim? Tzaddikim, they constantly go higher and higher. They're always elevating higher and higher. But it's always, however, in the same realm. Versus Baalei Teshuvah, that their Avodah is, when they do the Avodah, when you do Teshuvah, that it's total and absolute transformation. that the person becomes like a new entity. He becomes someone who, the person he was before doesn't exist anymore. He becomes a new person. And this was affected, this happened when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKodashim. And we actually see halacha that reflects this, and that is that the white garments, those special Yom Kippur garments in which the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKodashim, was never allowed to be reused. That means from year to year they would make new ones. Even when the Kohanim Gedolim were on the highest level. But you had to put them in Gniza, and you can no longer wear them. Why not? Because the garments you wore last year, and that they did the inyan of tshuva, the transformation, now it's not a continuation of it. This new Yom Kippur is a new total transformation, because inherently the idea of tshuva is that you're a brand new person, a person that didn't exist before. And this is the positive aspect, the positive idea of the name, the term Palhedrin. That every single year was a total change. There was a whole new person. And this is consistent with the idea that this was also when the Kohanim Gedolim were on the highest level, and they did have longevity. They didn't expire every year. Also then, every year was a new transformation. And then also the idea of Palhedrim applied. This aspect is so inherent in a Kohen Gadol, these two aspects, that when Rabbeinu HaKadosh, when Rabbi Yehuda set up the Mishnah, he set it up in such a way that he quoted both names. He calls it Lishkas Ha'etz, and he also calls it Lishkas Palhedrin. Why? Because in the Kohen Gadol has the two aspects. As we said before, the Kohen Gadol has the aspect of Eitz, which is the Avodah of Tzadikim, Arichas Yomim, and then also the Kohen Gadol has the aspect of tshuva. He brings about the inyan of tshuva, which is total transformation. And the Rebbe says, if you look closely, you'll see that specifically the choice of placement also makes sense. Where does Rabbeinu HaKadosh refer to this chamber as Lishkas Palhedrin? In Maseches Yoma. Maseches Yoma talks about the Avodah of Yom Kippur, which is transformation. Where does he call it Lishkas Ha'etz? In Maseches Midos. Midos is measurement. Everything is orderly. That represents the Avodah of Tzadikim. And now we can appreciate, we can understand why the wood had to be covered up, why it was plastered over. Because the main Avodah of Yom Kippur is not the Avodah of Tzadikim, but rather the Avodah of Tshuva. And therefore the wood, which represents the Avodah of Tzadikim, is covered up over. However, in spite of the above explanation, the name Lishkas Ha'etz was there in the beginning until Shimon HaTzadik, because then they were more visibly and actively on the level of Tzadikim, and the name Palhedrin came about later when the Kohanim Gedolim were already not on such a high level, they were on a much lower level. Why? Because even though the Avodah of Yom Kippur has to do with Tshuva, but until the era when there was a decline in the status and in the stature of the Kohanim Gedolim, like for example, till the end of Shimon HaTzadik's life, yes, there was Tshuva, but it wasn't that absolute Tshuva that we're talking about. The total transformation still was within the realm of Tzadikim, but Tzadikim also need to have Tshuva. And that's why they called it Lishkas Ha'etz. However, afterwards, when there was a colossal drop in the level of the Kohanim Gedolim, and that also reflects not only themselves, but obviously reflects the people that they're representing, that is the generation, then they changed the name to Lishkas Palhedrim to bring out more of this idea.